Some objects reside in spaces not because they are needed, but because they have always been there. They take up corners of rooms like old habits, not imposing, not forgotten, simply. Continuing, the mirror in the hallway was one such object. Oval in shape, its once glossy brass frame had dulled with time. The surface of the glass had long since ceased to be purely reflective. It no longer offered clarity, only approximation. You could still see yourself. Yes, but it was not quite you. And perhaps that was the point. It hung precisely at eye level, as if installed to remind anyone passing through that they were still here, still tangible, still seen. But the image it gave back was softened at the edges, as though someone had breathed onto the glass and left a trace of condensation. That never quite dried. No one remembered who had hung the mirror, or when. There was no date etched into the backing, no stamp of origin. It predated memory in that hallway. It simply was. Each morning, someone walked past it. Perhaps they paused, perhaps they didn't. But in its presence, everyone slowed, even if just by a half step, even if unconsciously. It wasn't an arresting kind of mirror. It didn't demand that you check your hair or adjust your coat. It was not a vanity mirror, not a place for admiration or correction. It was a quiet mirror, a watchful one, a kind of companion to transition spaces. Always there when someone entered or exited, but never acknowledged out loud. It was oval, and there is something about the oval shape that suggests containment without harshness. A rectangle feels architectural, a circle feels symbolic, but an oval seems to breathe. It is soft without being shapeless, specific without being rigid. The mirror's oval frame had curves worn down over time, the edges slightly chipped in places, but the structure remained intact. Tarnished, yes, but not broken. The surface still caught light, although never brilliantly, just enough to reflect a presence, a flicker, a motion. It was always cold, not in a metaphorical sense alone, though that could be said. The glass was cold to the touch, even in summer, even when the hallway basked in the golden light that spilled in from the south-facing window at the far end. Some said the wall itself retained a chill. Others suggested it had something to do with the backing of the mirror in old metal perhaps, or something buried behind it in the wall. But no one checked. No one moved it. There was a quiet understanding that it would remain exactly where it was. Each reflection it gave was slightly unfamiliar, not distorted like a funhouse mirror, not warped or cracked. The unfamiliarity was more subtle than that, like the version of yourself that stares back in a dream, recognizable, but not entirely trustworthy. Some said the lighting in the hallway played tricks. Others thought the glass had simply aged, like old windows that double or blur what they see. And yet others thought it had nothing to do with optics at all, but rather with time and how we perceive ourselves within it. As if the mirror reflected not only your face, but also your forgetting. A small, visual echo of the parts of yourself you couldn't quite carry anymore. People did look at it daily. That was the strange part. There were some who, when asked, would say they never really noticed it, but their eyes betrayed them. Their movements slowed as they passed. Their bodies turned ever so slightly toward it. There was a ritual to the glance, even if unspoken. And perhaps that was the mirror's purpose, if it had one at all, to remind, not of something specific, but of the act of remembering itself. The hallway, too, was a place of memory. It connected rooms without offering a destination of its own. A liminal space, a transitional stretch of floor and wall that existed not for lingering, but for passing through. And yet, the mirror lent it a kind of presence. It made the hallway feel less empty, less in between. It gave it a center, however quiet. In the evenings, when the hallway lights were dimmed or off, the mirror would still catch the faintest shapes, the glow of a candle, the silhouette of someone moving in the next room, but never clearly. It held shadows like stories. If you stood before it in the dark, your reflection would meet you, not quite in real time, a half-second delayed, like an old film reel catching up. And if you waited, if you held your breath, you might begin to feel as though you were looking at someone else entirely, someone familiar, someone once known. Children avoided it, not out of fear, exactly, but from instinct. They would run down the hallway with eyes fixed ahead, never turning their heads. As they grew older, they became used to its presence, but the unease never fully left. Not discomfort, just a deep-seated awareness that the mirror was not like other mirrors. It did not show you as you were, but as you might have been, or perhaps as you would one day become. On occasion, a guest would pause before it, drawn not by vanity, but by curiosity. They would peer in, frown slightly, then move on. Later, they might mention it in passing. That mirror in the hallway, it's odd, isn't it? And the answer, invariably, would be a shrug or a soft yes, as if acknowledging something too quiet to name, something understood without needing to be explained. The mirror outlasted seasons. Dust was wiped from its frame, but no one ever seemed to polish the glass itself. It was as if to clean it would be to erase something intangible, like lifting a thin layer of time and losing whatever was nestled within it. So it remained smudged at the edges, faintly streaked where fingers had once touched, where sleeves had once brushed against it. There had been stories, long ago, of someone who tried to remove it. A caretaker, perhaps, or a relative cleaning the house. But the moment they tried, the wall behind resisted. Not literally, there was no sudden win, no supernatural resistance, just a sense of rawness. As though the hallway grew tighter, as though the air had thickened, so the mirror remained, and that attempt was never repeated. What it reflected most faithfully was not people, but passage. The passing of light from morning to dusk, the slow fade of years into decades, the quiet continuation of days where nothing much happened, yet everything shifted. Birthdays without candles, goodbyes without luggage, silences without grief. All of it passed before the mirror, and the mirror held it gently, saying nothing. Some believed the mirror remembered. It kept versions of every face it had ever shown, that if you look long enough in the right light, you might see someone you used to be or someone who used to live. But no one tried, not for long. Staring into it too deeply was like trying to remember a dream you weren't sure you had. The effort itself made the memory slip further away. The mirror did not offer revelation. It did not tell truths or lies. It merely was. It reflected the present with the uncertainty of the past. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps, in a world full of clarity and demand, there was comfort in something that did not insist on being understood. In winter, when the hallway grew colder still, the mirror seemed to retreat into itself. Its glass grew more opaque, catching only the vaguest outlines. Some thought it was due to condensation, others to frost from the nearby door. But those who lived there knew better. The mirror was simply resting. It was part of the rhythm of the house, like the floorboards that creaked in apology, like the doorknobs that stuck on rainy days, like the ticking of the clock that always ran just a little late. All of them held memory. But the mirror held something older than that, a kind of stillness, a kind of waiting. And so it remained oval, tarnished, cold, and still watching, but not unkindly. In the quiet anatomy of a place suspended in time, certain objects remain not only as fixtures of space, but also as repositories of memory. Among these, a mirror occupies a special place. Not the kind of mirror that merely reflects light and symmetry, but one that holds weight, a symbolic burden that transcends function. This sentence, though brief, opens the door to a deeper emotional and psychological landscape. A place where memory is selective, forgetting is involuntary, and children, those instinctively attuned to the unseen, feel the quiet warnings of things adults explain away. Let us begin with the children, those intuitive beings who, by nature, operate in a realm that overlaps the imaginative and the perceptive. They don't stop to analyze why something unsettles them, they simply react. They ran past the mirror quickly, a physical manifestation of avoidance. Their motion is not merely about fear, but a bodily knowledge that some things are better left untouched, unseen, and unacknowledged. A mirror that doesn't show your present self, but what you are in the process of forgetting, becomes more than a curiosity, it becomes an intrusion. Forgetting is usually a passive act, an erosion over time. But if a mirror can actively reflect it back, then forgetting becomes visible, undeniable. We can picture the mirror itself, perhaps old, set into the wood of a hallway wall, the silver of its backing slightly tarnished. It does not scream its presence, but it is known. The hallway might be narrow, lit only by the natural light that filters in through distant windows. Shadows play across the floorboards and walls, stretching at odd angles as the day wanes. The mirror, stationed there for years, decades, perhaps has become part of the house. Not decoration, but more like a witness. In most homes, mirrors reflect presence. They show the now, the way your hair falls, the look in your eye, the shape of a smile. This mirror, by contrast, has been assigned perhaps by rumor or by observation a subtler power. It does not reflect who you are, but what you are losing. What does that mean? Truly, to show what you are forgetting, one interpretation is memory, plain and simple. We all forget things gradually. Faces, names, the feel of someone's hand, and the exact shade of a moment. Perhaps this mirror pulls those fragments to the surface. In its reflection, you might see not your own face, but the hint of one you once loved and barely remember. Or maybe the mirror returns the room to an older version of itself, objects no longer present, wallpaper long replaced, a childhood toy set in the corner. The mirror, then, becomes not a tool of vanity, but of vulnerability. It reminds us that loss begins quietly, and forgetting is not always chosen. But it could be more than memory. What if the mirror also shows fading emotions, abandoned promises, or versions of the self we've neglected? It might not be literal in its reflection, but abstract as shifting, uneasy feeling of displacement. A glance into it might bring a sense of unease, as if you've been reminded of something just out of reach. That's what makes it haunting, not because it shows ghosts, but because it reveals absences, emptiness where presence once was. Why would children respond to this so strongly? Because children, unencumbered by the rational explanations adults require, are more sensitive to emotional truths. They haven't yet dulled their instincts with logic or denial. To them, a mirror that feels wrong is wrong, full stop. They don't analyze, they act. Running past it becomes a ritual of protection, something passed down from sibling to sibling, embedded in the culture of the house. It's unspoken, but firmly understood. You simply don't look. It's not a game. It's not a dare. It's a rule. Then there is the eldest, the one who has perhaps spent the most time near it, the one who dared to look and came away changed. The eldest claims the mirror shows what you are forgetting, not what you are. There's something weighty in that phrasing. Claims implies belief, but not proof. The others have accepted this explanation not because it's been tested repeatedly, but because it fits the feeling. It gives shape to the vague discomfort. It makes the fear manageable. By naming it, the eldest has given the mirror a purpose, or at least a meaning. This act of naming is powerful. In folklore and storytelling, naming something gives it form and gives it rules. A nameless fear is chaos. A named one can be avoided, respected, or perhaps even defeated. By saying the mirror shows what is being forgotten, the eldest draws a boundary around its mystery. They don't claim it's cursed or haunted, they make it about memory, about the slow dissolving of connection. That makes it sad, not just frightening. And still, no one looks. The implications ripple further. If the mirror shows what is being forgotten, and if no one looks into it, then what is left to fade without witness? Perhaps the mirror is asking to be remembered, not for its own sake, but to rescue what is being lost. A photo left out too long in the sun. A voice you used to recognize but now can't place. A habit or routine you didn't mean to abandon. A childhood corner of the house that once felt magical but is now dust-covered and neglected. The mirror does not judge, it simply reflects. And yet, that is precisely why it is so powerful. It does not interfere. It simply shows you what you've already begun to lose. There's a tragedy here, quiet and slow-moving. We forget so many things without meaning to, and once gone, it's difficult to even know what has been lost. The mirror's unsettling power may be that it gives form to these intangible slips. It doesn't punish at morns, but in mourning, it holds us accountable. To look is to acknowledge that forgetting is an active, ongoing process. That loss is not an event, but a condition of time. We might imagine the eldest now, older still, remembering a moment when they did look. Perhaps they saw something they couldn't explain. A room arranged in a way it hadn't been for years, or a face that wasn't their own but was somehow familiar. Maybe they saw nothing unusual but felt an ache of hollowness that lingered after they walked away. It changed them, not dramatically, but permanently, just enough to form the basis of the warning. The others, the younger ones, take the warning seriously. They follow the path with eyes straight ahead, refusing the mirror's quiet invitation. It's not forbidden, exactly, just avoided. The way we avoid certain topics in conversation, certain rooms in old houses, and certain memories when they rise too close to the surface. Not because they're unbearable, but because they might be. The mirror becomes a symbol of selective silence, of things known but not spoken aloud. Every household has such silences. They gather in the corners, unacknowledged but ever present. This mirror set in a frame dulled by time, glass dimmed by dust reflects not people, but these absences. A slow accumulation of all the little things that once mattered, now misplaced. Not erased, but hidden, not waiting. In this way, the mirror almost takes on a role of quiet stewardship. It holds onto the things that no one else remembers, like an archivist of fading detail. It becomes a repository not of vanity, but of vulnerability, not of what you are, but of what you are losing. That difference is everything. The house around it, too, begins to feel shaped by this dynamic. If the mirror remains untouched, what else goes untouched? What other artifacts are allowed to sit in their slow unraveling? Does anyone still use the drawer where the old family recipes were kept? Does anyone still play the piano that's slightly out of tune? Does anyone sit on the back porch and remember how it felt in summers long gone? In this frame, the mirror is not isolated. It is emblematic. It is part of a larger forgetting, a broader drift into the haze of unacknowledged memory. It might be one of many such objects in the house, but it is the one most clearly understood to hold meaning. Its message is too stark to ignore, which is why, ironically, it is avoided. Yet something about it remains, something that keeps it from being taken down, hidden, or removed. Its presence is tolerated, its significance accepted, even if its truths are refused. There's a dignity to the kind of coexistence a household that respects its shadows, even when it doesn't step into them. The mirror does not demand interaction. It simply waits. In the end, this quiet tension between memory and forgetting, between presence and absence, between acknowledgement and avoidance is what gives the sentence its resonance. It's not about fear in the traditional sense. It is about the ache of remembering too late and the even quieter ache of forgetting too soon. So the children run, the eldest explains, and the mirror remains. It does not threaten, but it also does not lie. It simply reflects what you are forgetting, not what you are. And in that subtle difference, everything lingers. There are moments when the fabric of experience seems to shift just briefly, dislodging our sense of time, presence, and certainty. This sentence captures one such moment with quiet precision. One visitor turned to ask, "Who was that?" But no one else had seen anyone behind him. The room had been empty. At first glance, it is simple, almost mundane. But inside its simplicity lies a weight of this quiet and gentle unraveling of memory, perception, and the limits of explanation. It is about what we see that others don't, what we sense that leaves no trace, and how easily a moment slips from reality into ambiguity. The phrase begins with a visitor, just one. That word, visitor, already suggests transience. A visitor is not a resident. A visitor comes and goes, passes through a space that is not their own, and is granted only temporary access. This alone already places the figure on the edge of belonging. Perhaps he does not know the room well. Perhaps the air still smells unfamiliar. Or perhaps, like many visitors, He is trying to absorb a space that has long ago forgotten how to speak. And in this quiet, hushed room where even the floorboards seem to have settled into their roles long ago, he sees something no one else does. He turns. That action, small as it is, contains urgency. There is a desire to confirm, to share, and to ensure that something seen is not just the product of imagination. Who was that? He asks. He doesn't say. Was someone there? Or did you see something? His words are direct. He believes that he saw someone. Not a thing. Not a blur. Someone specific enough to prompt identity, to call for naming. The question implies not confusion, but curiosity. The phrasing suggests a person recognizable enough to feel real, even if unknown. And yet, the room offers no answer. No one else has seen anyone behind him. The past tense had seen makes it final. Not only did they not see someone in that instant, but now, looking back, they can confirm there was no one. The memory is already sealed. The moment is already judged. The verdict, nothing was there. And so, the sentence ends with a quiet thud of certainty. The room had been empty. The finality of that statement, placed after the visitor's question, shuts the door. Not just literally the room's quiet, but metaphorically, the moment's ambiguous. The room, in all its stillness and silence, confirms its own emptiness. It offers no mystery. It pretends nothing happened, and yet something did happen. Because someone turned, someone asked, and someone felt the need to name what had passed behind them. This moment, brief and unspoken, opens up many possibilities. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow? A half-formed memory intruding on the present? Or was it something quiet or something the visitor didn't even realize he was looking for until he thought he saw it? Sometimes we believe we see things that aren't there not because we are mistaken, but because we are reaching. The mind is not a passive mirror of the world. It is an interpreter, always filling in, always looking for pattern and meaning. In familiar places, we recognize. In unfamiliar ones, we search. A face in the grain of wood, a figure in the shape of a coat hung by the door, a movement just outside the corner of vision. These are not illusions, so much as small moments of projection. The visitor might have brought with him memories he had not yet processed, or questions he had not realized were still unanswered. Perhaps the visitor had been in this room once before, long ago. Perhaps the presence he thought he saw was a ghost, but not the supernatural kind. The ghost of someone once known, someone who belonged in that room, who used to walk its edges, who once stood just where that shadow would have been. Maybe it was the visitor's father, or sister, or someone who meant nothing to anyone else in the room but everything to him. Grief has a strange way of bending time. You might think you've set it down, only to glimpse it again, like a reflection that shouldn't be in the glass. This moment might not have been about seeing a ghost, but rather about remembering someone as shaped so vividly that it felt physical. Or maybe it had nothing to do with memory. Maybe the room really held something or someone that revealed itself to only one person. We often assume that what is real must be collectively verified, but realness is not always democratic. Some things are personal. Some presences only speak once and to a single person. The idea that no one else saw anything does not disprove the experience, it only isolates it. And isolation, in turn, makes the moment feel more fragile, more easily dismissed. There's also the deeper question of why the visitor asked aloud. Why not keep it to himself? Was he startled? Was he hoping for reassurance? Or was he hoping someone else had seen the same thing so he wouldn't have to be the only one? Speaking the question aloud turns a private moment into a shared one, and when no one else confirms it, that sharing fails. The moment becomes heavier for having been voiced. The room, silent and empty, takes on a kind of weight in the story. Not just physical emptiness, but emotional stillness. It refuses to validate the experience. It gives no echo, no clue. It simply was empty. And yet, it wasn't. For a moment, it was full of doubt, of memory, of potential meaning. That fullness passed as quickly as it came, but it lingered long enough to be spoken aloud. And that matters. The The deeper resonance of this sentence is in how it reflects human longing for connection, for affirmation, for understanding. The visitor wants someone else to see what he saw, not necessarily because he believes it was real, but because we are always looking for shared experience. To say, "Did you see that?" is to ask, "Are we in this together?" When the answer is no, a quiet loneliness takes its place. But loneliness isn't always sorrowful. Sometimes it is simply the quiet realization that we are each carrying our own fragments of the world. What we see, what we feel, what brushes up against us in a room others call empty, these things shape us in ways no one else will know. There is a kind of sacred privacy in these moments. Not everything needs to be confirmed to be real. The phrase "the room had been empty" is not just descriptive, it is narrative. It's what people say when trying to close a door on uncertainty, when trying to dismiss what doesn't fit. In history, in storytelling, and even in memory, we tidy up what we cannot explain. We say nothing happened not because nothing truly did, but because what happened cannot be measured. No timestamp, no witness, no evidence, just a question hanging in the air. Who was that? The room's emptiness is final, but not cruel. It doesn't deny what the visitor saw. It simply doesn't explain it. And in many ways, that is the essence of human experience. We move through spaces that hold more than we can name. We catch glimpses of the unspoken. We sense things that logic cannot pin down. And we live with a gentle ache of moments no one else saw. This moment also speaks to the nature of memory. Years later, the visitor might still remember the way that figures seemed to move just behind him. The way his question hung unanswered. The way everyone else looked at him not with recognition, but with polite confusion. Perhaps they thought he was mistaken. Or perhaps they simply didn't want to entertain the idea. People often avoid what they cannot explain. It's easier to smile and move on. And so the moment fades not erased, but quietly folded into the corner of his thoughts. Maybe he doesn't speak of it again. Or maybe he does, years later, when asked about strange things he's seen. "There was one time," he might begin, "in a room I visited just once." The beauty of this sentence lies in its restraint. It doesn't offer drama or resolution. It offers a pause, a slight shift in atmosphere, a ripple that barely disturbs the surface but changes everything underneath. It lets you feel the silence after the question. It lets you imagine the glance over the shoulder, the confusion on the faces around him, and the moment where certainty fractured just a little. And then it returns you to stillness. In the end, this line is not about whether something supernatural occurred. It is about attention, perception, the thin line between certainty and doubt, and how sometimes, even in a room called empty, something someone passes through. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the story of the visitor is not one that needs solving but simply remembering. As a reminder that not everything we see can be explained, not everything we feel can be proven, and not every presence leaves a trace. Some simply appear for a moment and vanish, leaving only a question behind. Who was that? There is something both quietly unsettling and deeply comforting about the idea of being in a place where time is slower, where not everything demands immediate explanation, and where the moments that pass are thick with implication, but light on resolution. The room in question wasn't grand. It wasn't eerie in the obvious way of old legends or ghost stories. It simply existed in the way forgotten rooms often do, quietly, respectfully, as if it had learned to stop asking for attention. The windows let in a pale kind of light, one that didn't pierce so much as soften, and the corners of the room held a chill that wasn't cold enough to mention aloud. It was the kind of room you entered and instinctively whispered in, not because there was any rule or reason to, but because something about it asked you to be gentle. The visitor hadn't meant to disturb anything. In truth, he hadn't even noticed the silence until he stepped into the room. It was the kind of silence that feels curated, not empty, a silence that has been cultivated over time. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of calm. As he entered, the floor didn't creak, although it should have. His steps made no real announcement. The air shifted around him in the way it does when a new presence joins an old space, not resistant, just cautious. There was no great weight to the moment, just a sense of having arrived slightly later than expected. He was not the first to enter the room, and he would not be the last. But at that particular moment, it was only him and someone else. Or so he thought. He turned, slowly, not with panic, but with a kind of polite curiosity. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice low, not even loud enough to echo off the old stone walls. The others who had joined him in the house, wanderers, record keepers, those drawn to stillness, glanced over with interest but not alarm. "Who was who?" they asked with a practiced kind of ease. Not dismissive, but certain. "There was someone behind me," he clarified, more to himself than to them. But the room had been empty. No one else had seen anyone. No shadow, no reflection, no flicker of movement in the corner of the eye. Just the visitor, standing alone near the threshold, looking back at where someone he was sure had just passed. They let the conversation drop after that, not because it was unimportant, but because it didn't demand more. This was not a place where every observation required explanation. Some rooms hold their histories in layers, not chapters. Some presences do not want to be named. The visitor didn't feel fear, only a vague sense of having interrupted something ongoing, something that continued whether it was acknowledged or not. He took a seat on the edge of an old bench. The wood was smooth and polished in the way only time and repetition can achieve. Not by hands but by years. The walls bore no portraits, only the quiet weight of being observed over generations. And still, that sense of having shared the room with someone lingered, not as a threat, not even as a mystery, but as a soft impression, like the faint scent of rain on warm stone. Others had felt it too, though they spoke of it only in metaphors. One said they'd heard the sound of footsteps long after they had stopped walking. Another once mentioned feeling a draft that seemed to move around them, like someone slipping quietly past in a crowded room, though the room was never crowded. No one described it as supernatural or paranormal. It felt more natural than that, like the place itself had a rhythm, and sometimes you arrive mid-verse. He glanced once more at the spot where he thought someone had stood. The light from the window had shifted just slightly, making the air shimmer a little near the doorway. Dust floated lazily through it, caught in golden strands of afternoon. Perhaps, if someone had been there, they wouldn't left a mark because they wouldn't have needed to. Some things pass through spaces the way thoughts pass through minds, softly, without demand, barely forming before moving on. Still, the moment stayed with him. The others eventually resumed what they were doing, some copied notes from old manuscripts. Others arranged small vials of dried herbs into patterns on low tables. Someone mended a torn sleeve with careful, patient fingers. No one spoke of the question again, but none of them forgot it. It wasn't the first time someone had turned to ask who was there, and it wouldn't be the last, because that's how places like this are. They carry more than memories. They carry impressions of footsteps, of glances, of presences that don't seek interaction so much as continuity. Not all visitations are interruptions. Some are echoes. Some is the breath between thoughts. Some are the pauses in a sentence that don't need finishing. The visitor sat with this realization like one sits with tea left to cool calmly, knowingly, accepting that it might never return to the warmth it once had, but that it was still meant to be held. Later, as dust settled against the windows, casting long shapes across the uneven floor, he stood and left the room slowly, not with urgency but with reverence. He didn't look back this time, not because he no longer felt the other presence, but because he no longer needed to confirm it. Some things are real only in the way that breath is real, not always seen, not always acknowledged, but necessary, felt, in the room. It made no protest at his departure. It simply exhaled softly, gently, resuming its stillness as though he had never been there. Or rather, as though he had always been meant to come and then to go. There was no inscription above the doorway, no marker on the wall, only the memory of a question asked quietly, Who was that? And the silence that followed, not as a void, but as a presence of its own. In time, the others would forget the exact moment, the way the light fell, the tone of the voice, the tilt of the visitor's head, but they would remember the hush that followed, the feeling of sharing space with something somewhat unseen, yet unmistakably there, and the room. It would remember too, but it would not tell, because some rooms, like some questions, are meant to remain unanswered not out of secrecy, but out of respect. There are objects that outlast their use. They wait long after the ones who placed them have gone, quiet in their stillness, untouched and undemanding. The mirror was one such object. It did not resist the silence that followed the final closing of the door. It did not shatter in protest or dim in grief. It simply remained, a rectangular slab of memory affixed to the wall, unmoved by the change in occupancy. Dust collected across its edges, and insects sometimes paused to trace its frame. But the mirror itself held its form and changed, unfailing. No one thought to remove it. Perhaps no one dared. There was something both ordinary and unnervingly final about a mirror in an abandoned place. Most things get cleared out, clothes taken for donation, dishes boxed, and books split among relatives or strangers at garage sales. But the mirror, heavy and reflective, was too permanent to discard and too embedded to carry away without consequence. And so it stayed, becoming part of the house the way a shadow becomes part of a figure, not essential, but always following. Years passed, and the house fell into that strange stage of half-forgotten memory. It wasn't famous enough to be protected, nor ruined enough to be noticed. Trees grew taller around it, their roots creeping toward the foundation. Vines curled along window frames, politely knocking against the glass, asking nothing. Inside, wallpaper peeled in slow strips like tired skin, and the ceiling bowed ever so slightly as though it, too, was tired of holding on. But the mirror held. It watched the room age around it without flinching, and it reflected. That was all it ever did. It reflected. But what, exactly? At first, it would have shown the backs of people bustling past, the man adjusting his tie before work, the woman fastening a necklace or smoothing down her dress, children holding up toys or scrunching their faces into silly expressions, just to laugh at themselves. The mirror once knew noise. It once caught glimpses of lives in motion, moments too fleeting to remember on their own. It once held the flicker of candlelight during power outages and the echo of a joke told, just out of earshot. It once saw tears blinked away before they could fall and hands smoothing hair before guests arrived. It saw the real and the rehearsed, the mundane and the meaningful all equal in the unblinking surface it offered. But now the mirror shows only what is left. An empty room, a warped floor, a chair still in the corner because no one ever needed it urgently enough to carry it out. If you stood in front of the mirror now, it would show you these things in reverse. Of course, but it would show them exactly as they are. There is no trick in reflection. The mirror doesn't interpret. It doesn't comment. It doesn't change based on who's looking. That's what makes it so quietly unnerving. A person can look into it and see what's there, but also without understanding why feel what's missing. That's the part no one talks about. The mirror doesn't just reflect light. It reflects absence. And absence, once reflected, becomes presence. You start to feel the gap, not just see it. You start to understand what used to be there, even if you can't name it. It's a kind of ghost made from omission, a hollowness shaped like something once alive. Visitors who stepped into the house on the rare occasion someone dared often stopped before the mirror. Not because they admired it, but because it gave them pause. It didn't scare them exactly. There was nothing ominous about it. The glass wasn't cracked. The frame wasn't baroque or theatrical. It was simple, familiar. But it carried with it the density of time that hadn't moved. Time that had stood still not because it had stopped, but because it had no one left to move through. The mirror didn't know it had been abandoned. It simply kept showing. Dust motes and sunbeams. A shifting shadow across the floor. The breeze made the curtain sway just enough to suggest movement elsewhere. A mouse once scurried across the floor, pausing mid-step as if caught in the act of remembering something. The mirror showed that too. The mouse didn't notice, but the mirror didn't care. Its job wasn't to be seen, it was to see. And it remembered, not in the way people do, with layers of narrative and emotion, but in the way that light lingers. If memory could be mechanical, neutral, and wordless, then that's how the mirror remembered. The woman who stood in front of it once with a baby in her arms. The teenager who practiced her lines for the school play. The old man adjusted a picture frame behind him just to get it centered in the reflection. All of these moments happened and were seen, and even though the mirror let them go immediately, it also never entirely lost them. That's the paradox of reflection. It's fleeting, yet continuous. Sometimes, on certain afternoons, light would strike the mirror just right, and the room would feel full, not with people, but with suggestion. The warmth of sunlight falling across the frame, the quiet creak of settling wood, and the hush that comes with places left untouched. Together they created a presence that didn't belong to anything living, yet didn't feel empty either. As though the mirror wasn't waiting for someone to come back, but simply acknowledging that someone had once been there. And that was enough. Children in the neighborhood made up stories about the house. They said the mirror showed your future if you looked long enough. Others claimed it didn't show your reflection at all. But the last person who stood there, a few were convinced it only reflected sadness, that it refused to show joy. But none of these were true. The mirror wasn't magical. It was honest. It showed exactly what was in front of it. The mistake was assuming that this wasn't already strange enough. A man came once, years after the house was listed for demolition. He wore gloves and carried a clipboard. He was efficient, methodical, and unbothered. He moved through the rooms with detachment, noting details and measuring spaces. But when he reached the room with the mirror, he paused, just for a moment, just long enough for something to settle in the air. He didn't write anything down. He stood in front of it and adjusted his tie without thinking, the way someone once had. Then he left, and the mirror continued. That was what it did best. It continued. It didn't require permission or notice. It didn't need someone to interact with it in order to fulfill its purpose. It simply offered back what was presented to it, quietly and completely. It had no opinion, no interpretation, but it had presence. It had continuity, and over time, that became more than enough. At night, the room grew darker, and still the mirror reflected what it could. The faintest trace of moonlight, the glimmer from distant street lamps through broken slats. The mirror was not blind in the dark, it simply waited, knowing that light always returned. Morning always came, and when it did, the mirror did what it had always done. It reflected. The house will one day fall, whether from demolition or the slow surrender of time. The walls will crumble. The roof will collapse. Wind will whistle through where windows used to be, and eventually, the mirror will crack, dot, or break, or be buried beneath the debris. Its surface will no longer show anything. Its frame will warp. Its silver backing will flake and peel. But even then, the memory of the mirror will remain not in photographs or archives, but in the way it held stillness, in the fact that it saw without holding on, that it bore witness without explanation, that it stayed when everything else left. That, perhaps, it showed us not who we were, but that we were. And that was something. The mirror didn't need to be magical to be meaningful. It only had to do what it always did, reflect. Because in the end, to reflect is also to honor, to recognize, to say, this was here, this passed through, this mattered if only for a moment. And in that abandoned room, in the hush that followed footsteps long gone, the mirror stayed, waiting, not for someone, but the next moment is worth seeing. Every few weeks, a letter would arrive, and always in the same way. It came folded in that slightly old-fashioned style, sealed with a thin strip of adhesive that never quite held all the way to the edge. It was not rushed, not urgent, and not conspicuous. The envelope was always pale, perhaps white once, now softened to a muted cream by time, or travel, or maybe simply the kind of paper that forgets how to be bright. The postmark was there, clear, but unhelpful dates and cities stamped in vague ink, from locations that seemed to drift across regions as if the sender couldn't stay in one place. Or didn't he want to be found? The stamp was always correct, Of course, carefully chosen. Carefully placed in the upper right corner, but never interesting, never seasonal, never collectible. A stamp that did its job quietly. The handwriting was the most memorable part. Not florid, not ostentatious, no loops that swirled unnecessarily, no dramatic flourishes. But it was beautiful, clean, consistent, oddly timeless. The kind of penmanship taught in a decade where people still practice their signature for hours. Where each letter was expected to stand up straight and behave itself. The letters looked as though they had never been in a hurry and perhaps had never been late. Each one was addressed to a name that had long since stopped receiving mail, though no one officially said so. It was always the same name, always the same handwriting, always the same lack of return address. The letters were placed in the same wooden tray behind the counter in the post office. The one slightly bowed in the middle from years of holding mail and memories. No one ever claimed the envelopes. No one ever opened them. And yet, no one threw them away. It seemed wrong, somehow disrespectful, to discard them, even though they were technically undeliverable. There had been talk, once or twice, about sending them to the dead letter office. But each time, the conversation fizzled out, replaced with a mutual shrug or a change of subject. They stayed. That was all. They arrived, they waited, and they stayed. People in the village noticed, of course, quietly. They didn't gossip about the letters, not aloud. But in the back of their minds, they registered the rhythm of it. Every few weeks, as regular as the changing tide or the creak of the church's wooden bell frame, a letter would arrive. Someone would place it in the tray. The tray would hold it. Children, as children often do, invented stories. They whispered theories during long walks home or on foggy mornings near the bakery. Some believed the letters were from a traveler lost in time, sending missives from a parallel place. Others thought it was a ghost, someone who had forgotten they had passed on, continuing their correspondence out of habit. One said it was a love letter that had been mailed decades too late, perhaps delayed by war or misdirection, and now endlessly caught in the wrong year. A few simply imagined it was someone old and alone, somewhere not too far, trying to reach a version of themselves that still lived in memory. The postmistress never opened them. She handled each envelope with care, though she never looked overly curious. She had her own routine, worn smooth by repetition. She dusted the tray every Friday, even if it didn't need it. She turned each envelope once, checking for damage, before tucking it neatly behind the others. She didn't read the postmarks out loud, but sometimes her eyes lingered on them a moment longer than necessary. There had once been a ledger, a logbook, where she'd written the dates each letter arrived, along with any small differences, a darker paper, a slightly bolder pen, a minor smudge. But even that habit faded with time. The letters no longer surprised her, so they no longer required recording. Now she just let them accumulate like snowfall, quiet, unobtrusive, soft around the edges. Sometimes, at the very end of the day, she would glance at the tray before locking the front door of the post office. Not long, just enough to notice that it was there and that it was still doing what it had always done, holding things that no one claimed, things that had been sent deliberately but landed in limbo. People passing through the village rarely noticed the letters. Why would they? They came for the old stone bridge, or the market that's set up near the square on Wednesdays, or maybe just a drive through hills that still remembered the shape of horse-drawn carts. The post office didn't advertise itself as special. Its bell above the door was faint and slightly uneven. The floors creaked in patches. A small radiator kept it warm in winter. There was no computer behind the desk, only pens and rubber stamps and a pair of spectacles always set to the left of the scale. But the letters went on. Sometimes, one of the villagers, often one of the older ones, would pause while sending something of their own. They glanced toward the tray and nod, just a little. Not a greeting, exactly. Not a farewell either, just a recognition. This thing still existed. This story hadn't ended. There was one boy, no longer very young, who used to ask about the letters when he came to collect parcels for his mother. He'd point at the tray and ask, "Has it come again?" The postmistress would nod. He never asked who it was for. One day, without any fuss, he stopped asking. He still came for the parcels and still thanked her politely. But he never pointed again. Something settled in the silence like dust. Theories continued quietly. People love puzzles with no clear answer, especially the kind that don't demand solving. A few times, someone new to the village would mention the letter and be gently, kindly redirected. Oh, yes, that happens. And that would be the end of it, as if curiosity was allowed, but only up to a certain threshold. One winter, when the snow came early and covered the roads faster than expected, a letter arrived. The postmistress, who had been late the day due to the icy hills, found the envelope already placed in the tray. That was odd. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask who'd brought it in. She simply added it to the others, smoothing its edges and making sure it wasn't damp from the cold. Then she made tea. The year changed, then another. The tray never filled completely, but it never emptied. Sometimes she removed the oldest letter to make room and place it gently into the drawer beneath. The drawer, like the tray, never quite filled either. One day, someone new was hired to help at the post office just part-time. She noticed the tray her first week and asked, "Do I need to sort these?" The postmistress smiled, soft and tired, and said, "No, they stay." That was all. No explanation, no story, just the instruction. The young assistant obeyed, though now and then she'd run a finger along the edges of one letter and wonder, quietly, what it might say. But she never opened one. No one knew for sure if anyone was still sending them. Perhaps they were mailed years ago and arrived on delay. Perhaps they were being written now by someone who thought their words might still matter. Or perhaps they were never meant to be read at all, just meant to arrive, to rest, to remain. And still, the postmarks came. The addresses blurred gently with time. The paper yellowed in soft corners. The ink stayed stubborn, refusing to fade. And every few weeks, the doorbell of the post office would chime once. A letter, carefully written and lovingly addressed, would appear in the tray, still unclaimed, still without return. Some stories end loudly, others never start, but a few, like these letters, live quietly in the space between the gentle rhythm of a sender who still believes, and a destination that doesn't mind waiting. There is a quiet persistence in the habits of people like the postmaster, those who become the stewards of forgotten things, who maintain a kind of sacred watch over what others have long abandoned. His job, on the surface, is simple: sort, stamp, place, and distribute. But the job never really ends, even when the letters do, even when the names on the envelopes fade into the background hum of the town's silence. He places each letter into that same small cubby, day after day, year after year, knowing it won't be collected. The mail is never addressed return to sender, never redirected, and never marked as undeliverable. He simply places it there, as if by ritual, as if by quiet hope. He doesn't question why he continues. It has become part of the rhythm of the place, this tiny village that no longer waits for much, but still moves in the gentle groove of what once mattered. In the room that smells faintly of old glue and dry paper, the cubbies stand like memorial niches, each holding echoes of names, greetings, and handwriting that tried once to mean something. This particular cubby is filled with letters that seem more like whispers than correspondence. Postmarked years ago, addressed in looping script or rigid block print, sealed with care. They have all waited. The postmaster doesn't read them. He knows that would break something of trust, perhaps, or a boundary between the living and what they left behind. But he lets his fingers linger on the edges sometimes, brushing against the yellowing corners, sensing the weight of what was once urgent. A letter asking after someone's health, a birthday card sent late, a form that needed signing. He knows the kinds of things people write when they believe there is still time to connect. But these messages were never claimed, and now they are held not in anticipation, but in respect. The cubby itself is nothing special. It's just a small wooden space, slightly more worn than the others, perhaps because he handles it with more care. The floor of the compartment is slightly curved now from the cumulative pressure of years, like a shallow cradle for memories that no longer expect to be remembered. Dust settles in its corners gently, like snow on an unused path. And still, he doesn't remove them. To do so would be to concede something, to admit that no one is coming back for them. He's seen others throw them away without hesitation. Other towns, other stations, dead letters, they're called, tossed into bins with the matter-of-factness of bureaucracy. But something in him won't allow that. Maybe it's the way the handwriting speaks in silence, or the imagined sound of the person writing, or the imagined face of the one who should have received it. Maybe he simply believes that if something was once meant to be read, it still matters, even if the moment for it has long passed. Each letter carries a kind of ghost, not haunting, exactly, just a presence. They come with stories he will never know, locked in envelopes that are never broken. Some are bent at the corners. Others are pristine, as if they traveled from one forgotten place to another without ever being touched by life in between. And some are heavier, containing something more than words: a photograph, a folded bit of paper, or an enclosed object meant to delight or comfort. He doesn't peek. That isn't his role. His role is the holding, the waiting, and the not letting go. Sometimes he thinks about who wrote them. He pictures the hand dipping a pen or tapping a typewriter, the brows furrowed in concentration, a quiet kitchen, a desk by a window, a moment when someone thought, they will want to hear this. He imagines the sealing of the envelope, the walk to the mailbox, and the dropping in, a hopeful sound, and then the wait on the other end that never came. Other times, he imagines the recipients, those who never opened the doors again, never returned, never answered. Did they move? Die? Forget? Did they once read a different letter that made this one irrelevant? Or were they lost in a space that never allowed them to collect it? These are not questions with answers, and he doesn't need them. The not knowing is part of the ritual. The story isn't his to resolve. There is a kind of sacred neutrality in what he does. He neither demands nor denies meaning. He simply lets it be. In a world that insists on updates, refreshes, replies, and reactions, he tends to a corner where time is settled differently. The letters do not call out. They are not desperate. They are simply present, like the smell of old pine in the walls or the bell that no longer rings. Others in the town know about the cubby. Some think it's strange that he keeps those letters. Others think it's kind. A few are quietly grateful that someone still cares for what no one else remembers. Once, a boy asked if he could look inside, and the postmaster said no, gently, as if the letters were sleeping. There's reverence in the refusal. The boy didn't ask again. Seasons change around the post office. Snow falls, melts, grass grows, and dries. Rain taps against the windows. Leaves scatter across the stoop. Through it all, the cubby remains undisturbed. The letters age, but not unkindly. They simply continue, and the postmaster continues, too. Every morning, he unlocks the door, sets out the mail, sweeps the floor, and places new letters into the right places. And always, that one cubby. Always the same care. Always the same gentle hesitation before moving on to the next. He doesn't tell people what he thinks about the letters. He wouldn't call it melancholy or sentiment. He wouldn't call it anything. But there are days, quiet days, long shadowed and slow, when he sits with his cup of tea and looks at the cubby with a feeling that doesn't he need a name. It's not sadness. It's not longing. It's something softer. Something that says, this mattered once. That's enough. Over time, he has come to understand that the cubby isn't really full of letters. It's full of what people tried to say. And that, in itself, is a kind of dignity worth protecting. Words sent into the world with intention carry an echo. And as long as they are held somewhere, that echo doesn't entirely fade. Even if the recipient never reads them, even if the writer forgets what they wrote, the gesture itself endures. That's the weight he guards. On rare occasions, someone will come in asking for an old letter, something they thought might have been sent long ago. The postmaster always checks the cubby. Sometimes, miraculously, he finds it. A face lights up. A moment reconnects. The letter was fulfilled. But more often, No one asks. No one remembers. And still, he keeps them. In another place, in another time, someone might have called the postmaster foolish. Might have said, "It's just paper." Might have laughed at the idea of preserving what the world clearly abandoned. But he knows better. He knows that people leave traces of themselves in small gestures. Those letters are never just letters. They are pauses, offerings, and attempts. They are a person saying, "Here is a piece of me, sent to you." To throw that away would feel like silencing something that still hums, however faintly. So, he keeps them, and the cubby remains, and the paper settles into its shape, and the air, tinged with quiet ink and distant longing, holds still. It is not a monument. It is not a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is simply a space that carries memory without requiring it to explain itself. A room in the world that says not everything needs closure. Not everything needs to be returned or resolved. Some things just need to be kept, gently, unquestioned, undisturbed, because somewhere, once, someone cared enough to write. And here, now, someone cares enough not to forget. It began without urgency. There had been a box on the shelf, or perhaps a drawer long shut. It was not locked, and it had never been hidden. It was simply there. Like so many things that remain not because of use or meaning, but because no one ever thought to remove them. The letter waited, paper curled slightly at the corners from years of passive time. Its ink just a touch faded, but no less legible. The girl hadn't meant to find it. She was not looking for anything in particular, not chasing after mystery or history. She opened the drawer to retrieve something ordinary, perhaps a cloth or an unused candle, and instead found a letter resting silently, as though it had always expected her. There was nothing strange about the letter. That was what made it so remarkable. No riddles, no codes, no desperate cries or unresolved heartbreak. It was not a farewell or a confession, not a declaration or a demand. Instead, it was quietly, thoroughly kind. Its words were gentle, meandering like a slow brook over smooth stones. It did not rush to its point because it had none to push. The letter simply spoke of springtime. Not a particular springtime, not marked by dates or events, but a feeling, a moment. It described the way the sun rested on windowsills for longer than it had in winter, and the way the scent of earth began to rise as the frost sank back into memory. It talked of how people stepped outside again without their arms crossed over their chests, of how laundry hung outside no longer froze into stiff shapes but danced. The writer had noticed small things: the return of bees, the uneven green sprouting through the stones in a courtyard, the way the bakery's door was propped open by mid-morning. The letter lingered on the sound of children's laughter in alleyways, a laugh with no ceiling. Rising high, it mentioned a patch of tulips that leaned far to the left but bloomed stubbornly nonetheless. There were no names, no clear addressee. It could have been for anyone. It might have been for no one in particular, but its tone made it feel as though it had always been meant for whoever would one day hold it. And that springtime the one so lovingly described was one no one remembered. That, too, was not strange. Memory does not archive with precision. Even the loudest moments are softened, rearranged, or entirely lost. But there was something hauntingly beautiful in the realization that such a soft, generous season could have passed through a place, leaving behind only this, a letter quietly waiting, its tenderness pressed between the folds of paper, like petals kept for no reason other than their color. The girl sat with it. She didn't rush to show anyone. There was no need. It wasn't a letter that begged to be shared, only to be understood. She read it again, slower the second time, lingering on certain lines as if they were familiar to some part of her beyond conscious memory. She could almost feel the season described not through her own recollection, but as though the letter had drawn it out from wherever forgotten warmth hides. That kind of spring wasn't about calendars or meteorological thresholds. It was about the shift that happened slowly in the soul, a softening, a remembering of joy without reason. It is an odd kind of truth that kindness often leaves less traced in conflict. People remember being hurt more sharply than they remember being held. We catalog pain as a warning but forget comfort as if it were to comment a note. And yet, this letter had done just that. It had written down the softness of a world at peace with itself. It had made the case that noticing the gentle could be just as urgent as surviving the harsh. In doing so, it resisted the erasure of tenderness. No one knew who wrote it. The handwriting was elegant, but not ornate, practiced, but not theatrical. It did not match any of the known scrawls in the family Bible, nor any signatures left behind in the margins of other stored letters. It might have been someone who had lived in the house or someone who only visited once. Perhaps a tenant who stayed in one of the upper rooms for a single season long ago. Or someone who sat by the window one morning and felt compelled to put into words what they sensed would soon be gone. There is something achingly humble about a letter written with no guarantee of a reader. Not a journal meant to be private. Not a note passed with a promise of response. Just an expression offered into the void of time, folded and stored. Perhaps it had been forgotten, or perhaps it had been placed carefully with the quiet hope that someday someone would need it. And now, the girl had found it not in crisis, not in grief, but in stillness. She had not been searching for solace, but she recognized it when it arrived. The room around her was unchanged. Dust still gathered. Light still crept across the wooden floor at its slow afternoon angle. But the letter seemed to shift the air slightly. It did not feel like a ghost story. It felt like an inheritance of feeling. A message not from the past, but from the persistent presence of gentleness. That kind of letter is not about remembering dates or names. It is about remembering how to feel attuned to small good things. How to pause at the window when the breeze changes and say nothing but still know something sacred has passed through. She did not ask anyone if they remember the spring described in the letter. Somehow, it felt like asking would only diminish it. If they said no, the magic might dim. If they said yes, it might become something else, less intimate, more historical. She didn't want to know if it had truly happened in a way others could confirm. She wanted it to remain personal and, in that way, universal. Like a dream that doesn't need explaining, only keeping. Later, she tucked the letter back into its envelope, not to hide it, but to preserve its quiet dignity. She placed it not deep in the drawer, but near the edge, where someone else might find it again without looking. The letter had waited for her. One day, it would wait for someone else. That, too, was part of its kindness, that it did not ask for permanence, only presence. Outside, it was neither winter nor spring. The day was in between, as so many days are. The trees were bare, but the ground was soft. The clouds were gray, but light moved through them in waves. And as the girl stepped outside, she found herself noticing things she might have otherwise ignored: the shape of a cracked stone in the path, the faint sound of birdsong too distant to identify. She stood still for a moment and let the air pass over her like a page being turned. Perhaps the letter was not about springtime at all. Not really. Perhaps it was a gentle reminder that the world, even in its smallest, quietest gestures, was worth writing about. That beauty existed even when no one was looking, and to name it was a form of reverence. The letter was not strange because it did not need to be. It did not reach for drama. It rested in the soft spaces most people skip over. And as the day passed, as dusk crept in with its familiar shadows and silvered skies, the girl thought again of the letter. Not its sentences, but its tone. A warmth that did not fade when the paper was folded. A kindness that asked for nothing in return. That was what stayed with her. That was what she would carry forward, not as a memory of something lost, but as a reminder of what could still be noticed, what could still be felt, what might still be written down if one remembered to pause long enough. There was no announcement, no flyers nailed to posts, no bells rung, no proclamations declared in the square. There wasn't even a pause in the rhythm of the day to signal something was about to begin. It simply happened one Sunday, quietly, unceremoniously, the way clouds begin to gather without anyone noticing until the light begins to shift. She arrived just before noon, though no one really saw her come. She didn't climb the steps with any flourish, nor did she stand on anything raised. There was no podium, no platform, and no indication that this place had been prepared for performance. The only marker, if it could even be called that, was the weathered weather vane, turning gently in the breeze overhead, creaking with age as it pointed nowhere in particular. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and so, in that sense, it offered a kind of permission to stand beneath it. Not authority, exactly. More like permission by forgetfulness. No one had claimed the space, and so it was quietly open. She had a stack of papers, some handwritten, others typewritten, some crumpled and softened by age, others crisp as if just pulled from a drawer long unopened. She did not introduce them, nor herself. She did not say where the words came from. She simply began reading. Her voice wasn't especially loud, and she didn't raise it to reach any particular distance. It was the kind of voice that was used to rooms without audiences, clear, calm, but not performative. It was as though she read for the sake of the reading itself, not for listeners, not for applause. At first, no one stopped. A few people glanced in her direction, mildly curious. Others might have thought she was rehearsing or perhaps lost in thought. One person thought she might be praying. Someone else thought perhaps she was speaking to someone only she could see. But curiosity wasn't strong enough to interrupt habit. People passed. The day moved on. And yet the next Sunday, she returned. Again, at noon. Again with papers in her hand. Again beneath the weather vane. And again, she read aloud to no one in particular. The words were not dramatic. They were not chosen to provoke. They were not sermons or stories with endings. Sometimes they were fragments, an unfinished letter, a recipe with missing ingredients, a list of names without explanation. One afternoon, she read what seemed to be a shopping list, pausing between each item as if allowing it to settle into the air. Other times she read passages in another language, perhaps forgotten, perhaps made up. Something about the reading felt and hurried. It was not that time stood still, but that it slowed slightly, the way air thickens just before it rains. People began to pause, not to listen at first, but just to make sense of what they were seeing. A woman speaking softly beneath the weathered weather vane, with no sign, no context. Some found it unnerving in its quietness. Others found it oddly comforting. And then, as weeks passed, the pauses became longer. A child sat cross-legged on the stone path nearby, not understanding the words, but watching the rhythm of her breath. An older man stood by the wall, pretending to read his newspaper, but letting it lower inch by inch. A pair of sisters, passing by with baskets of bread, stopped and tilted their heads toward the voice. The first to actually sit was a boy. He didn't mean to stay long. He simply grew tired. Or maybe he just wanted to see if the words would change if he listened to all of them. When he sat, nothing happened. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't look up. She kept reading, and so he stayed. The next Sunday, there were 2 more, then 5, then 10. But never a crowd. That wasn't the nature of it. The reading never sought a crowd. People came and went as they pleased. Some returned each week, others only once. Some said they couldn't quite remember what was read, only how it felt. It wasn't performance, and it wasn't ritual. It was something more fragile, something you didn't want to define too tightly for fear it would crumble. There were no expectations, no applause, and no discussion afterward. People sat in silence, then left in silence. Yet it did not feel solemn. It felt attentive, as though the reading wasn't demanding anything from them. It was simply allowing them to be near something that didn't ask to be explained. Eventually, a bench appeared. No one remembered placing it there. Then another. Someone brought a jug of water and small paper cups. A child drew a chalk circle on the cobblestone where the woman always stood. Someone began sweeping the area before noon so she wouldn't have to read over fallen leaves. People asked, once in a while, who she was. No one could say. She didn't speak outside the reading. She didn't stay long afterward. But she wasn't distant, just quiet. Like a librarian who knows where everything is but waits for you to ask. Some began to speculate about the papers. Were they hers? Were they historical? Were they fragments found in the attic of a closed schoolhouse or saved from a flood? No one knew. No one asked, and she never explained. Because to explain, it might have disrupted something. The reading was not about understanding the past. It was about sitting with it, about letting the words settle around you like dust in a still room. You didn't need to know who had written them. You didn't need to interpret them. You just had to hear them. Some Sundays she read only a single page. Other times, she read for nearly an hour. Once, she read what appeared to be the same sentence over and over until it stopped sounding like language at all and became a kind of chant. A strange thing began to happen. People began to bring their own papers. They didn't read them aloud, but they held them quietly, like talismans. Some were blank, some had drawings, some held folded corners and smudged ink. There was no collection, no sharing, just presence. Like the papers wanted to be near the reading, even if they weren't read. One Sunday, she didn't come. People waited anyway. Some thought she might have simply been delayed. Others thought maybe she had finished whatever she'd set out to do. But no one left immediately. They lingered, and then, slowly, one by one, they began to read aloud. Not loudly, not competitively, just enough for the air to remember the shape of her voice. A child read a story she had written in school. An old man recited a poem he had memorized decades earlier. Someone read a weather report from a newspaper dated 20 years prior. It wasn't the content that mattered. It was the act of giving it voice. She returned the following week, said nothing of her absence, began reading again as if no time had passed. But something had changed. Not in the ritual, if you could even call it that, but in the space around it. There was now a quiet understanding that listening is a form of remembering. That reading aloud is not about performance, but presence. That sometimes the words we think are ordinary carry something sacred when spoken with intention. And still, she never gave her name. Years later, people would speak of the Sundays beneath the weather vane as though they had always existed, as though the sound of her voice had always been folded into the breeze that rustled the nearby leaves. Children who had once listened with tilted heads now returned as adults, holding their own papers, unsure whether they would read or simply listen. But they came, because there was something steady in it, something tender and unchanging. In a world where noise often crowds out attention, this was a space where quietness was allowed to take up room, where meaning didn't need to be declared, where someone could read and someone else could listen. And that was enough, not because the words were grand, but because they were spoken. Because sometimes, just saying the forgotten things out loud is its own kind of ceremony. At first, it was a curiosity. A story passed between neighbors in the quiet lull between conversations spoken just under breath, half believed, half dismissed. The house at the end of the lane, with shutters like eyelids and walls that creaked only when the wind was elsewhere, had long stood silent. And yet, letters arrived, regularly, precisely, folded neatly, sealed plainly, and always placed just so on the table in the parlor, or tucked behind a book, or occasionally under the cushion of a chair no one had sat in for years. The recipients were never obvious, but the handwriting was always the same, careful, unhurried, timeless, ink that neither smudged nor faded, words that said very little and yet implied everything. The story grew quietly. Those who had once lived in the house were long gone. Some had moved away. Others had vanished into time the way old routines do. But the mail continued. A letter every week, at least. Sometimes more during storms. Always addressed with no name. Sometimes a word. Remember. Listen. Still here. Sometimes no words at all, just a page of feigning strokes like a forgotten language, or a kind of humming turned visual. People made guesses, of course. A caretaker slipping them in unnoticed, a prank by children too consistent to be believed, or perhaps drafts left behind by a past occupant that had simply never run out. But slowly, the tone of those who whispered the tale began to change. They no longer spoke with bemusement, but with a quiet kind of reverence, as if the house had transitioned from odd to sacred. You see, it wasn't just that the letters were there. It was how they began to seem aware. One mentioned the sound of rain and it rained at night. Another described a dream no one had confessed aloud. One letter arrived the day after a death in the village, and it simply read, "I'm still listening." It was signed with nothing, but many swore the loops in the cursive mirrored the name of the deceased. No one saw anyone come or go. Dust remained undisturbed. Windows stayed locked, and so the suggestion was made at first by a child, without sarcasm or fear that perhaps the house itself was writing them. It was laughed off at first, of course, but after a while, the laughter grew nervous, then reluctant, then it stopped altogether. The house, after all, had always had a presence, not a threatening one, just a sense of listening. The kind of place where a misplaced object might be returned, not where you last left it, but where you had needed it to be, where floorboards didn't creak in complaint, but in reply. A place that, when locked, still felt occupied, not haunted, exactly though that word would often get whispered, just attended to mindful present. There was no explanation, not one that satisfied both logic and experience. No machines, no gimmicks, no one hiding in the walls. The letters bore no fingerprints. The ink couldn't be traced, and perhaps strangest of all, none of the messages ever repeated, yet all felt familiar. Like memory speaking back. Scholars visit, briefly. Paranormal investigators, too. Cameras were set up, watched, and inevitably failed. Recordings caught only silence, not even the rustling of paper. The letters appeared when eyes weren't watching, as if the act of observation disrupted their becoming. A mystery, yes, but one without the drama of fiction. No banging doors, no flying objects, just quiet, dependable evidence of something enduring and inexplicable. The letters themselves varied in tone. Some were brief, just a sentence or two, written in calm, unadorned lines. There's still warmth in the floorboards. He left the scarf by the hearth. It still carries the scent. The rocking chair paused for no one. Others told longer stories, though never complete. Fragmented memories, perhaps, or the echo of someone else's unfinished thought. One particularly long letter described in gentle minute detail the setting of a tea table, how the cup was turned slightly to the left, the sugar cube sunk without a stir, and how the spoon was laid precisely parallel to the edge. A quiet record of care that no living person remembered performing, yet some older villagers said the scene felt oddly familiar, as though once watched through a childhood haze. And still, the question persisted. Who wrote them? And after a while, that question softened into something less demanding, less expectant. The villagers began to accept the possibility that not all questions required answers, at least, not in the usual sense. Some houses were made of brick and wood. Others were made of memory, and perhaps this house was composed of both in equal measure. Those who spent time near it said they felt a kind of comfort, a stillness not from emptiness, but from presence, like sitting in a room where someone is reading quietly in the next chair. Some even claimed to hear the scratch of a pen late at night, not loud, not spooky, just soft, deliberate, as though the house were, indeed, remembering something aloud in ink. No one dared stay overnight, at least not more than once. Not from fear, exactly, but because after a single night, they felt changed. Not harmed, not haunted, just seen, like something in them had been observed, recorded, and gently filed away, as if the house had taken note, and perhaps it had. Over time, a kind of ritual emerged. People began to leave messages for the house, tucked under loose floorboards near the porch, or slid gently beneath the old door. They wrote what they could not say aloud: apologies, small joys, names of people they missed. The house never replied directly, but the next letter, though never dated, always felt like a response. One girl wrote, "I don't know if he heard me say goodbye." A week later, a letter appeared in the parlor. He knew. The letters never stopped. Through seasons, through generations, Through weather that stripped paint and warped beams, they continued. Neatly folded, calmly written, never intrusive, never alarming, just present, like breath, like memory's handwriting. Some came to believe the house wasn't T writing at all, but that the letters had always been there, existing outside of time, and the house was simply revealing them one by one, when the moment was right, like a book you don't read all at once, like a song revealed in single notes. Others said the house had absorbed so much life, so much routine, grief, laughter, and love that it had become fluent in the language of those who had lived there. It wrote, not because it had a mind, but because it had witnessed so much. Its walls had soaked up the emotional ink of years, and now they bled gently back onto paper. In later years, the letters became more sparse, not gone, just quieter, more minimal, a single line, a half-drawn shape, an unfinished sentence, not as though the house had forgotten, but as if it trusted the reader to complete the thought. Or perhaps the story was nearing its end, not dramatically, but naturally, like a conversation winding down after hours of presence. And yet, new visitors still received them. A tourist passing through once found a note in their coat pocket that hadn't been there before. You paused by the mirror. Thank you. They hadn't mentioned it to anyone, but they had paused, only for a moment, to check a reflection that didn't seem quite their own. So the house remains. Doors locked, windows shuttered, but alive in the way quiet places sometimes are. It doesn't hum, or cry, or groan. It just listens, records. And sometimes, when the moment calls for it, responds. And the letters? They are still found, folded in attic corners, slipped between forgotten books. Sometimes, even inside closed drawers that no one remembers opening. Still written in the same hand. Still saying almost nothing and somehow everything. It is not for us to know how or why, only that they come, that they are read, that somewhere in the quiet mechanisms of wood and wind and memory, a house might sometimes speak not in words shouted or moan, but in soft ink strokes, just enough to say, you are here. You are still held in mind. You are not entirely forgotten, and perhaps that's all anyone ever really asked for. Some passages of language hold entire stories inside them quietly, with no need for spectacle or overt drama. This is one of them. Within these 3 short lines lies a meditation on time, memory, habit, and the overlooked signals of change. It is sparse but deliberate, rich with stillness and tension in equal measure. Let us walk through it slowly, and as we do, we will unfold the layered emotions and meanings that lie beneath the surface of this deceptively simple fragment. We begin with the line, 10 years had passed. This is a declaration of time, not a day, a week, or a season, but a full decade. There is something solemn and heavy about this choice. It signals that what came before mattered deeply, enough to remain relevant across 10 long cycles of seasons. Yet that same line also introduces loss, not necessarily of tragedy, but of active attention. Time did what it does best. It moved forward. 10 years passed not as a headline, not as a recorded anniversary, but as a simple fact, unembellished. There's no sense at the end of this sentence. 10 years since what? It is left unsaid, and that omission is one of the most telling parts of the fragment. We are asked to understand that time has moved on, not because someone was counting, but because enough small, unnoticed moments accumulated until they became years. The next line continues, no one marked the exact day. Here, the emotional weight deepens. Not only did time pass, but the awareness of it faded. Whatever the moment was, whether it was loss, departure, change, or silence, it wasn't commemorated. This absence of acknowledgement can come from many emotional places, grief to deep to face, memory to blurred to pinpoint, or even a collective decision to let time soften something painful. When no one marks the exact day, it doesn't necessarily mean no one remembers. Instead, it means that remembrance took on a quieter shape and spoken, unrecorded, and possibly shared without being discussed. There's a kind of resignation here, but also reverence. The people involved, be they villagers, a family, or a single person, let the date drift. It became a season, a general echo, a feeling that returned around the same time each year without ever settling on the calendar. Then we reached the final line. But the weather vane, rusted but steady, turned west once more. And here the passage opens up into metaphor, motion, and subtle symbolism. The weather vane is a perfect object for this kind of scene, stationary yet alert, fixed yet sensitive. Its presence is rooted, tied to the roof of the tower where it sits, and yet its very purpose is to respond to the invisible changes in the air. The fact that it is described as rusted but steady tells us two things at once. It has aged, worn, and been exposed to the elements, and yet it remains reliable. There is both frailty and durability in this image, much like memory itself. And then it turns. It turned west once more. This is the moment of subtle drama in the entire fragment, not a thunderclap, not a shout, but a whisper of change after long silence. The turn westward implies motion, implies a shift. It might have been stuck or still for years, holding its position like a sentry watching over time. But now it moves, something perhaps in the wind. And the world itself has changed enough for the weather vane to respond. It turns, not with fanfare, but with inevitability. The direction matters, too. The West is often symbolic in literature and folklore. It is where the sun sets, the place of endings and closures, but also of rest and resolution. In many traditions, to turn westward is to prepare for reflection, to acknowledge what has come before. When the weather vane turns west, it might be signaling the return of something long awaited, or the readiness of those below to face whatever they have not named. After 10 years, this gentle movement might be the first tangible sign that the world is breathing again, paying attention again, or healing. Let's now pull back and consider the setting that is implied here. This line lives in a world that has been waiting. A quiet village, perhaps, or a household on the edge of habit. The environment is not loud, and neither is its narrative. Life has gone on. Clocks have ticked, meals have been made, and chores have been done. But over everything, there was a stillness, maybe even a suspended breath that lasted a decade. And now, with the movement of a piece of old metal, something has changed. It is the first note in a new song, or perhaps the last note of an old one, finally reaching its end. What makes this scene so moving is its restraint. Nothing is explained. There is no exposition, but every word is deliberate. We are not told who lived through the 10 years, or what was lost, or why the weather vane matters. And that's what gives this passage its power. It allows the reader to imagine, to fill in the spaces with their memories, losses, or long waits. It mirrors how time works in real life, not in bullet points, but in quiet repetitions, in small symbols, in things that move without being noticed until, suddenly, they matter again. There is also a great tenderness in the portrayal of the inanimate. The weather vane, with its rust and steadiness, becomes almost a character, aging, watching, waiting. Its turn is described not as a reaction, but as a return. Once more. This phrase suggests a pattern, a rhythm interrupted. It hints that the West was once its common direction. Maybe that was its resting place, or maybe it always turned west on a particular date. Whatever the case, something familiar has happened again, and its familiarity is what makes it strange because it's taken 10 years to recur. And now let us imagine the boy from an earlier vignette, the one who noticed the weather vane shifting. Perhaps he stands in the same village. Maybe he doesn't remember the event that passed 10 years ago. He might have been a child when the silence began. But the weather vane turning catches his eye. No one else notices. But he looks up, and that act of seeing, of acknowledging the movement, is the beginning of a quiet unraveling of time's hold. The weather vane has moved, and someone has seen it. That is enough. Let us also consider what it means when no one marks the exact day. Time, in its purest form, has no edges. But humans create anniversaries, clocks, calendars, all in an attempt to make sense of the flood. So when people don't mark something, It might be out of defiance or out of pain. It might be because the day was too ordinary or too sacred to speak aloud. Not marking the day doesn't mean forgetting. It can mean the memory became a part of the atmosphere, just like the weather vane, just like the rust. It settled into the rhythm of days, woven so thoroughly into life that people stopped naming it. And yet something shifted. Whether it was the wind or the world or the memory itself, the weather vane turned. That one motion becomes a small miracle, the kind that doesn't make headlines but sits heavily in the heart. The kind of miracle that says, we have changed, even if we don't know how. The wind has changed, and it's not just weather. There is a beautiful humility to this image. It avoids the grand and instead leans into the ordinary. A turning weather vane, a forgotten date, a rusted piece of metal. But these details matter because they are the ones that fill most of our real lives. We are made not of big moments, but of subtle shifts. The decision not to remember a specific day, the slow way rust gathers, the tilt of a weather vane after a stillness too long held. In the end, this passage is about presence, not loud or urgent, but constant. The presence of time, of memory, of the wind itself. It is about the way the world carries on, even when no one is watching, and how sometimes, after many years, it offers us a sign that things are beginning to move again. The weather vane is not just turning, it is telling. It is saying, yes, it has been long. Yes, the day was never named, but something still remembers. Something still turns, and someone, somewhere, will look up. There are moments in human life that are not taught, nor consciously chosen, but instead gently absorbed, woven into the rhythm of living, so subtly that no one notices their beginnings. These moments, these patterns, become rituals without ceremony. No invitation is given, no announcement made, and yet people gather. The hill, unnamed and unremarkable to outsiders, had long held a quiet pull. It was not famous nor scenic in any conventional way, but its slope leaned just enough to catch the last gold of the sun, and it overlooked nothing in particular, just a stretch of fields that blurred into forest, or perhaps into forgotten land. And yet, every evening, as the shadows lengthened and the air shifted from warm to cool, people came. They didn't speak of it. They simply arrived. At first, there had been a reason, though even the oldest residents couldn't quite remember it. Some said there had once been a bell that rang from the top of the hill, a single, resonant note at the hour of dusk. Others believed there had been a tree, long since cut down, that bloomed in a way no other tree did. A few recalled stories of a figure who used to stand there every evening, holding a lantern that never ran out of oil. But no one could agree on the details. These fragments, held like loose threads in different minds, never wove into a single memory. Instead, they drifted in the background like the wind itself, present but invisible. The people came without knowing why they came. They gathered not for a spectacle, nor for a ritual they could name. It was not grief that brought them, nor joy. It was something gentler than either, something that lived just beyond articulation. Perhaps it was longing. Perhaps it was the comfort of repetition, the safety of returning to a place that asked nothing of you except your presence. Children ran along the ridge, their laughter mingling with the rustle of dry grass. Parents watched, their expressions unreadable but soft. The old sat in silence, eyes on the horizon, not waiting for anything in particular. The conversations, if there were any, were hushed. People pointed at clouds or birds or the shifting light, but not in wonder, in recognition, as if the sky itself were an old friend passing by, and they were noting the details simply to remember them better later. No one organized these dusk gatherings. There was no schedule, no reminder, but they happened with an eerie consistency. On cold days, people came wrapped in shawls, cheeks flushed pink from the wind. On warm days, they sat on warm blankets, arms around knees. On rainy days, fewer came, but someone always did, even if it was just a single figure, standing still at the edge of the hill, watching water blur the line between earth and sky. What made the gathering special was not the presence of anything spectacular, but the absence of urgency. In a world that often moved too fast, here, Time slowed. It was not frozen, it moved softly. Like the turning of pages in a book no one was rushing to finish. Dusk itself, the gentle in-between, stretched just a little longer on the hill. And in that space, people remembered things they hadn't realized they'd forgotten. The wind was different there. It wasn't stronger, nor colder, but it carried with it a weightless familiarity like a tune heard once long ago, now hummed unconsciously. It brushed against skin in a way that reminded people of something, not a moment, not a place, but a feeling. It was the feeling of something once cherished, of a spring afternoon long past, of sitting beside someone who has since vanished, though their presence lingers in the bones. It was not memory itself, but the scent of memory, the trace of it that stirs without speaking. It is not uncommon in life for actions to outlive their reasons, for the body to remember what the mind has let go. That's what the dusk gatherings were. The continuation of something that had mattered once. A ritual that had once been rooted in meaning, now kept alive by its echo. And yet, that echo was enough. Some visitors, unfamiliar with the hill's quiet significance, would ask what everyone was doing. Is it a festival? They might say. Is it a memorial? But no one had an answer. Locals might shrug. It's just what we do. They'd reply, not unkindly. And the visitors, if they stayed long enough, often returned the next evening. Even they felt it, that strange pull, that almost memory caught in the breeze. Not all who came understood what they felt. Some left puzzled. Others came once, then never again. But many stayed. They began to arrive earlier, just to sit. They brought nothing with them. They didn't take pictures. They didn't check their watches. The hill didn't demand reverence, it simply allowed presence. It became a kind of open page, a moment in the day that belonged to no one and everyone. Elders sometimes whispered stories to the children, fragments of what might have been true. They spoke of a woman who used to sing at dusk, of a bell that tolled only when someone was born or died, of lanterns placed along the ridge to guide someone home, though no one remembered who. These stories had no dates, no names. They were passed down like weather, changing a little each time, but always somehow familiar. Over time, the hill bore marks of these habits. The grass lay flatter in the places people most often sat. The dirt path leading up were smooth under countless quiet footsteps. A few stones were arranged in a semicircle, though no one admitted to placing them. Bits of ribbon sometimes appeared, tied to the branches of a nearby bush. Never bright, always muted colors that matched the sky. These were not offerings, exactly. They were acknowledgments, small gestures that said, I was here. At certain moments, the hill seemed to exhale. Perhaps it was the way the light shifted through mist, or the silence that fell between two breezes. It felt as though the land itself remembered something, something it couldn't quite share, but chose to honor anyway. And the people, even without understanding, mirrored that honoring. They didn't need the full story. The act of being there was enough. Seasons changed, and still they came. In autumn, the leaves are collected like scattered pages. In winter, footprints mark the snow, careful, soft, deliberate. In spring, the hill smelled of damp renewal. In summer, fireflies sometimes flickered near the base, like sparks from a thought unfinished. No one wrote down why they came. No monument marked the reason, and yet it mattered. Because in a world where so much disappears, memories, buildings, even languages, there is something quietly powerful about persistence, about returning, about showing up again and again for something that can't be named but feels necessary. And the wind, faithful and unchanging, continued to carry the scent of remembrance. It moved through hair, across shoulders, around ankles. It played with the hem of someone's coat and stirred the leaves in a rhythm no one led. And though it never spoke, it was understood. Something had once happened there, or perhaps many small things, or maybe nothing at all, nothing except years of people sitting together at the edge of the day, allowing dusk to pass through them like a thought they hadn't finished forming. Not every place needs a story. Some simply need to be held, witnessed, occupied gently, without conquest. And that was what the people did. They gathered, not because they were told to, but because something in them remembered how. So they kept returning to the hill, where the sunlight bowed low and the shadows stretched like questions with no answers. They returned without asking why, without needing more than the soft rhythm of presence, and in doing so, they gave the place its meaning not by defining it, but by letting it be. Some moments arrive without spectacle, without preparation, and yet they resonate far deeper than any grand announcement could. This sentence, brief and quiet as it is, carries the weight of both time and renewal. The act of a child climbing a tower and ringing a long silent bell, not in grief, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement, echoes with layers of meaning. In its restraint, it allows for a spacious kind of reflection, inviting us to explore history, memory, and how silence is sometimes more eloquent than sound. The bell, a central figure in this moment, is not just an object, it is a witness. Bells in human civilization have long held symbolic significance. They call communities to prayer, warn of danger, mark the passage of hours, and celebrate rites of passage. A bell that no longer rings is often a marker of a time past, a task no longer needed, or a voice no longer heeded. The silence of such a bell is not necessarily an absence. It is often a presence of something else, a held breath, a memory, a respect for something too complex to articulate. That the bell has not rung in so long that it has become almost like a monument to waiting tells us something about the world it inhabits. Perhaps people pass by the tower each day, eyes glancing upward, minds remembering what once was. But no one dared to climb, not out of fear, but out of a tacit understanding that it wasn't time, or perhaps out of a belief that its time had passed. Then comes the child, not a leader, not a messenger, not an elder weighed down by years, but a child. Innocence embodied, curiosity incarnate. Children do not always follow the unspoken rules of stillness and hesitation that adults adopt. Where others see sacred silence, a child might see possibility. Where others feel the gravity of memory, a child feels the pull of instinct. And yet, this child doesn't ring the bell recklessly. Not in alarm, not in mourning. The act is deliberate, but not ceremonial. The bell is not summoned to announce chaos or sorrow. It is rung in acknowledgement. But acknowledgement of what? This word acknowledgement carries a gentler gravity. It is not dramatic. It is not sensational. It is the kind of action that says, I see you. You mattered. You're not forgotten. Acknowledgement is the quiet nod in the hallway, the hand laid over an old stone, the candle lit without speaking the name aloud. It is memory without mourning, presence without intrusion. The child's action is a bridge between what was and what still is. When no one else had moved toward the tower, when the bell remained suspended in its stillness, it was not grief that stirred the air, it was something lighter, yet stronger. The child steps up the tower, wooden, dusty, perhaps creaking slightly underfoot, to represent something subtle but transformative. A journey not of conquest, but of connection. There's a particular kind of beauty in the fact that there was no announcement. The town did not gather in a square. No town crier called out the deed. The child was not instructed or prompted. They simply climbed, quietly, naturally, as if answering a call no one else could hear. There's mystery in that. Had the child heard something others didn't? Or did they simply see what others had forgotten to see? And yet the town responds not with fanfare, not with parades, but with listening. They hear the bell, one chime, singular, sufficient, not a tolling series of sounds, not a dirge or a summons. One chime, as if to say, yes, yes, we were here. Yes, this mattered. Yes, we remember. The idea that the bell had once been used for grief or alarm suggests that its voice had been associated with urgency, with loss, with something to fear. In many towns, bells were used to warn of approaching danger, fire, or death. They were the voice of the town in its most vulnerable moments. To ring it again, but not in any of those contexts, is to change its story, to reawaken it gently, to give it a new place in time, not as a relic of sorrow, but as a participant in continuity. This shift from sorrow to acknowledgement is profound. It says that we don't only have to remember the past with pain. We can remember with reverence, with gentleness. A place, a sound, a symbol can be transformed not by force, but by choice. By the quietest among us making a decision no one else had dared to make. In many ways, this act is also about presence. The child is present. The bell is present. The moment is not about recreating the past, but about meeting the present with openness. It's about choosing to live beside memory rather than under it. That single chime becomes a breath the town didn't realize it needed. Perhaps the people below stopped in their tracks, not in alarm, but in recognition. Maybe they looked to the tower and remembered something they hadn't thought about in years. Not just the last time the bell rang, but what it had meant to them. Maybe some felt sorrow. Maybe some felt peace. Maybe most just stood still for a moment, sharing something unnamed. There is a kind of collective grace in unspoken understanding. No one rushes up to ask why. No one interrupts. The bell has been acknowledged, and by extension, so has everything it once stood for. The child does not claim ownership of this act. They simply climb, ring, and descend. There is no speech, no explanation. The power of the moment is that it does not require one. And still, the act changes things. From that point on, perhaps the silence around the tower feels less weighted. Maybe people begin to walk past it not with avoidance, but with thoughtfulness. Maybe someone leaves a flower at the base of it. Maybe someone else starts tending to the path that leads to the door. Maybe on quiet Sundays people gather nearby, not to reenact anything, but just to be there, to be part of whatever it is the child touched. The bell has sound a tone suspended in air. For a moment might remain in memory longer than the actual moment itself. People may not remember the exact tower, but they'll remember how it felt. They'll remember that it was not sorrow, not warning, but something else entirely. A closing of one chapter or the soft beginning of another. We often wait for official permission to act, to remember, to acknowledge. We look to leaders, ceremonies, or anniversaries. But sometimes the most powerful gestures come from outside those systems. A child does not need permission to honor what once was. They need only the freedom to do so. And when they act, they remind everyone else that acknowledgement is a choice available to all of us. In broader human terms, this moment speaks to the endurance of memory and the quiet power of witness. The bell did not forget its purpose. It waited. The town did not erase its history, it simply didn't know what to do with it. The child didn't try to fix the past, only to meet it gently. And in doing so, they gave it space to breathe again. This idea that we can coexist with memory rather than be weighed down by it is vital in both personal and communal life. The past does not need to dominate our present and honored. Acknowledgement is enough. It is not loud. It is not urgent, but it is true. And so, when the bell rings not in grief, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement, it creates a new kind of sound. One that does not ask for panic or tears, but simply presence. It says, we were here. We are still here. And we remember, not because we are told to, but because something in us chooses to. The child does not become a legend. The bell does not ring every day after. Life resumes. But now, it resumes with something added. A stillness that holds resonance. A past that has been met, not denied. And a sound that once symbolized loss, now quietly echoes with grace. There is a peculiar gravity in quiet gestures, those subtle occurrences that mark the passage of time. Not with ceremony or spectacle, but with a soft resonance of meaning felt rather than declared. In this brief passage, we are given a scene that resists clarity, that invites stillness instead of resolution. A bell rings a single note, unaccompanied. The wind changes direction. No questions are asked, no answers sought. And yet, something shifts. Something is acknowledged, even if unspoken. In that space between sound and silence, between movement and stillness, the world turns. It is not a declaration of change, but a recognition of its inevitability. To begin with, the bell is central, not just as a literal object capable of making sound, but as a long-standing symbol throughout history and human consciousness. Bells have signified beginnings and endings. They call to worship, warn of danger, commemorate the dead, and celebrate the living. A bell is never neutral, it always means something, even if what it means is no longer known. So when we hear that the bell rang once, we are asked to listen not just to the note, but to the silence that follows. It is the singularity of the event that lends it gravity. One chime, not repeated. No echoing chorus. No ritual. Just a sound that punctures the air and then is gone. Why did the bell ring? That is not the question we are encouraged to ask. The beauty of this moment lies in its resistance to interrogation. It is not a mystery to be solved, but a moment to be felt. The phrase "no one asks why" is not born of indifference, but of understanding, or perhaps reverence. The kind of reverence that acknowledges that not everything needs to be explained. Sometimes things happen, and our task is not to decode, but to witness. To let the sound of the bell wash through us and accept its presence without demanding justification. Next, the wind turns. This too is subtle, easily missed. A change in the wind can be imperceptible if you're not paying attention. It might shift a curtain, stir a leaf, raise the hair on your arm. The wind, like the bell, is a natural force with no intrinsic agenda. It doesn't announce its reasons. It simply moves. And yet here, its movement is paired with the sound of the bell. One follows the other not causally, but rhythmically. It is a sequence that implies change, or at least transition. The bell sounds, and the world breathes in a new direction. We are not told what the wind turned from or toward. We are only meant to feel the gentle uncoiling of whatever came before. There is a quiet power in the line, "No one asked why." It says more than its few words suggest. In a world that often demands explanations, justifications, timestamps, and narratives, the idea of not asking why is radical. It implies trust, or perhaps a kind of weariness and earned wisdom that comes from seeing cycles repeat themselves enough times to know that asking why is sometimes beside the point. The event happened. That is enough. The bell rang. The wind shifted. No one needed to find a reason. Sometimes, meaning is not found in understanding but in presence, in witnessing without questioning. Then we arrive at the final line. It was enough to remember that something had passed and something remained. Here, we are offered a gentle conclusion, not of answers, but of recognition. Something passed. What? A life, a season, a tradition, a moment. It is deliberately vague, and yet the heart knows what the words mean, even if the mind does not. This is the language of grief and continuity, of acknowledging what is gone without trying to resurrect it, and simultaneously, of acknowledging what is still here. The juxtaposition of past and remained is poignant. These two forces are always in conversation. Loss and memory, ending and endurance. What fades and what lingers? The bell's note vanishes into the air, but the fact of its having rung leaves a residue. The wind that turned may already have shifted again, but that moment of movement of change was real. The memory is not anchored in explanation, but in experience. To remember is to preserve something, even if we don't fully understand what it was. This passage, in its quiet compactness, evokes the larger themes of time, memory, and impermanence. It resists grand narrative, choosing instead to illuminate the beauty in a single, contained moment. And it resonates with those moments in our lives when we, too, hear the metaphorical bell, a change we can't explain, a shift we can't name but we feel it, a funeral bell, a birth cry, a final goodbye, a beginning that doesn't announce itself, a feeling that something is different even if the world looks the same. The passage also speaks to the human relationship with ritual and its quiet disappearance. Once, the bell may have had a clear purpose. Perhaps it was rung daily, or during specific events. Perhaps it was once a communal sound, recognized and interpreted by all. But here, its single ring is untethered from tradition. There's no ceremony, no gathering. It simply rings, and is done. In that way, the bell is like memory itself, brief, echoing, and ultimately transient. We can also read this moment as an allegory for emotional processing. Often, in the human experience, there are changes we feel before we understand. A shift in the air when someone we love pulls away. A tone in their voice. A silence where there used to be laughter. These shifts, like the turning wind, are subtle but real. The bell's ring could represent the first note of realization, the moment we know something has changed, even if we haven't named it yet. We don't always ask why. Sometimes we just know, and we carry that knowledge forward, unspoken, but no less significant. The line "it was enough to remember" is one of acceptance. Not satisfaction, not closure, but the soft letting go that happens when we stop trying to control what we feel and simply allow ourselves to feel it. Remembrance is its kind of preservation. It does not demand analysis or conclusion. It simply honors what was, and in doing so, it allows what remains to continue not untouched, but transformed. The structure of the passage, each sentence, its distinct moment, mirrors the pacing of real reflection. Time slows. The bell. The wind. The stillness. Memory. These are steps in a silent ritual. The moment is neither long nor loud, but it expands when you sit with it. It opens like a quiet room where everything has its place and nothing begs for attention. It invites you not to listen harder, but to quiet yourself until you can hear what was already there. The emotional resonance of this passage is profound because it validates the small, nearly invisible moments in life that carry weight. It tells us that not all turning points are loud. Not all transformations are immediate. Some are so gentle we only notice them in hindsight. The day the bell rang once. The day the wind turned. The day no one needed to ask why. That day might not be marked in a calendar or history book, but it mattered. It mattered because it was felt. In this way, the passage is also a meditation on presence, on being attuned to the world in a way that doesn't require explanation or validation. It teaches us that noticing is its kind of knowing, that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that ask nothing of us but awareness. A bell rings, the wind turns, something shifts. We remember, and we remain. So often, our instinct is to demand meaning from events. We ask why because we hope that knowing will bring comfort or clarity. But this passage suggests another path, the way of quiet acknowledgement, not passivity, but reverence. A way of moving through the world with open eyes and soft hands, willing to hold things lightly, to witness without needing to possess. Ultimately, this short passage offers a gentle, elegant articulation of what it means to live through change without resistance, to let things pass without demanding they stay, to feel something shift and not fear it, to allow the past to exist without dragging it forward, and to trust that even in silence, even without answers, we carry meaning with us. It remains, like the echo of the bell, fading into the wind but never quite gone.